Okay, audio 3, let's go on to slide 16 and take a look at some of the early Chinese communist leaders. Now the big point, there's a lot of detail here, but the big point about this slide is that the Chinese communists had a whole bunch of leaders in their early years, and none of them were worth a hoot. They were relatively weak individuals. They took orders from Moscow, and indeed it was the Russians who established an underground station in Shanghai in about 1919 and began to find local leftist leaders who could be cultivated into good communists and lead a Chinese Communist Party. And it was the Russians who decided when to found the Chinese Communist Party in July of 1921. And it was the Russians who gave direction, indeed orders, to the Chinese Communists in their first years. Some of that direction was good, some of that direction was crap. And all of these men were completely beholden to Moscow, every single one of them. Li Dajiao is an interesting figure. He and the rest of them are mostly revered today in Chinese Communist history. He was taking refuge in the Soviet embassy in April of 1927, right after the coup d'etat against the communists by Chiang Kai-shek in Shanghai and other cities, when the local warlord, Zhang Zuolin, decided to invade the Soviet embassy. And he and a number of other people were strangled on Zhang Zuolin's orders because Zhang Zuolin was no friend of Moscow. The CCP Central Committee, which was the leading body, resided in Shanghai, even though Shanghai was in the hands of the of anti-communist forces and was, of course, completely controlled, really, by the British and the French and, to some extent, the Japanese. Why did they go there? They had to live underground. They had to live in secret. These are the leaders of the party. Why on earth didn't they go out into the countryside where, for example, Mao Zedong was successfully forming a Red Army base in Jiangxi province in southern central China? Well, they did it because Moscow told them to do it. They stayed in Shanghai because these were orders from the Kremlin or from the Communist International, which was a fictional, largely fictional bunch of baloney that was the sponsoring organization for communist parties throughout the world. The reason I have such harsh words for the Communist International is that the people who ran it were put there by Stalin, and their entire purpose was to make sure that foreign communists were following the line of Moscow regarding making sure that they supported Soviet foreign policy. So with Chinese communists, for example, the big thing was starting an eventual revolution in China that would assist the unification of China under the nationalists, because Stalin thought that before you have communism, you have to have a bourgeois bourgeois revolution, and you have to have the formation of capitalism. China was not really in a capitalist stage yet, therefore China had to go through capitalism first and eventually have a communist revolution. But the big thing that was really important to maintaining communism in one country, which became Stalin's policy after the death of Lenin, was to keep the Japanese off balance, to keep them occupied by hostile forces, hostile Chinese forces in China, so they wouldn't have any thoughts about invading the Soviet Far East. That was the bottom line in Moscow's foreign policy and indeed in Chinese communist policy. Another interesting figure is Bo Gu. You'll note there that he was briefly the general secretary or the leader of the political bureau, the Politburo. So at the top in the Chinese Communist Party, you have the general secretary, who's the top office holder in the political bureau or the Politburo. The Politburo is elected from the Central Committee. Today in China, the Politburo has 7 members. That is the Politburo Standing Committee. Back then, in the time of this slide, there was no standing committee. There was just a small Politburo, technical stuff. But Bo Gu became so dissatisfied with the rule of Mao Zedong in Yan'an in 1943 that he probably became an agent of Soviet military intelligence in 1944, and he was later killed in a plane crash, which may or may not have been coincidental, but it's hard to say. Let's go on to slide 17. So another group, now these are, the people you see here are also Chinese communist leaders, obviously, and all of them, for the most part, except for Dong Bi-wu, the last man on the previous slide, who was older, are part of what historians refer to today as the May 4th generation. This is from the May 4th, 1919 movement that resulted because of the Versailles agreements that gave those German colonies back to Japan rather than back to China at the end of after the end of World War I. So the May 4th movement that began then, that brought demonstrations in Beijing, which were suppressed by gunfire by Yuan Shikai's soldiers, or the remnants of Yuan Shikai's soldiers, anyway, the people who controlled Beijing at that time. This generation of leaders cut their teeth, in essence, in demonstrations against authority during this period. They believed in organizing the masses. They believed in especially organizing other educated young people. They believed in starting newspapers. They believed in rousing anti-foreign sentiment bit by bit so that eventually there could be organization that would drive foreigners out of China. They were outraged at the way the Japanese were conducting themselves. They were suspicious of the West because the West didn't seem to live up to their high ideals of democratic forms of government unless it was in their own countries. And they put a lot of hope in the Russian Revolution. However, as they organized, for example, Zhou Enlai, pictured here as a young man, organized at Nankai University in Tianjin, which is the city that is to the immediate east of Beijing. He found himself being thrown in jail for organizing, and eventually he figured out that unless he pursued more clandestine activity, that he would end up, like a lot of people, being hung by his thumbs and maybe being killed. And so he eventually joined the Chinese Communist Party because he concluded that they were the only hope for organization that would actually lead to an independent and sovereign China. So let's go on now to slide 18. And note that following the death of Yuan Shikai, again, in 1916, the generals who were loyal to him, out of self-preservation, started to consolidate their own territories, and there was, with Yuan Shikai gone, there was no unifying figure, and so there was, as there have been many times in Chinese history, there was this period of separate states that ruled their own territories and occasionally fought with each other, but mostly just tried to preserve their own power. The Japanese were entrenched in several places, mostly Manchuria. They had some power that they were able to apply to an eventual concession that developed in northern Shanghai. But for the most part, they were in Manchuria. They, of course, had all of Korea, so that meant that they were able to project some power into Manchuria along the Korean border. They also had the Guangdong Army. Guangdong is a Chinese place name, and it refers to the Japanese garrison and area of control that was relatively small around the present-day city of Dalian in Liaoning province, which, if you're looking at that peninsula that juts down to the southwest away from Korea there, that's colored orange or whatever that color is, on this map, Dalian is at the end of that peninsula. So Japan's hold in some places in Manchuria was there, and republicanism was still in its infancy. Zhang Zuolin was the most powerful force in the region, not because he was more powerful than the Japanese, but because he controlled the most territory. Let's go on now to slide 19 and talk about what the Russians began to do once the KMT secured a little bit of territory in Canton. They did so near Hong Kong now, in the south, Canton or Guangzhou. They did so with the cooperation of a local warlord, and the Soviets realized that this was an opportunity to foment the Chinese Revolution, so they reached an agreement with Sun Yat-sen to provide arms, ammunition, advisors, and lots of money and training in exchange for Sun Yat-sen allowing them to organize the Guomindang in a particular way. And that particular way is referred to nowadays as Leninism. What is Leninism? Coming from the word Lenin, as in Vladimir Lenin. Leninism means organizing with a revolutionary elite that is highly educated in the norms of communist revolution, organizing with them at the center, with them making the decisions. They're elected, in a sense, by their peers, and there's discussion within this elite group of what to do. But once the decision is made, everybody obeys it at the top, and everybody down below who was not involved in the decision-making in the first place just obeys. That's a rough way of putting it, but in essence, that's Leninism. And the KMT became, became a Leninist organization. The Russians wanted to overcome the warlords and unite the country because, again, they wanted to keep the Japanese from expanding their power in China and therefore being able to challenge the Russians in the Far East. The Russians had interests in Manchuria at this point. They had a railroad that they owned, and they, of course, bordered Manchuria, and they did not want the Japanese to expand all over Manchuria and down into China and then be able to turn their attention to challenging Russian power on their own territory in the Far East, because the Japanese. I'm going to have to stop this recording here, and we'll try again. I really need a drink of water.